Hello and welcome to Wednesday Bible Studies. Today we're going to be doing Exodus chapters 37 to 40.
Ezekiel 33:3.
So we'll be taking a look at an overview of Exodus, and then we'll look at Exodus chapters 37 to 40, which was the reading for this week. We'll do questions from the study, and then we'll assign the reading for next week. We'll start with our overview of Exodus. Exodus 1:8 to 11. Then a new king who did not know Joseph came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to the people, the Israelites have become too numerous and too powerful for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase even more. And if war breaks out, they may join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So the Egyptians appointed taskmasters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor. As a result, they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. The city that was missing from the Masoretic text that was in the Greek Septuagint was the city of On. The reason why that's important is because in front of your government buildings, you'll find these big pillars. The city of On was also known as Heliopolis, or Pillar City. The Greeks also had a god called Helios. So a lot that was practiced in Egypt was actually brought into other nations, including Europe. Exodus 2 and 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. The lineage of the Levites. This is the focal point, really, of Exodus. It's covering all the tribes, but the Levites are leading. We've got Levi, which is where the word Levite comes from. Kohath, Amram, and Jochebed are the mother and father of Moses. Jochebed is quite interesting as her name has the Lord's name within it. The reason why this is interesting is because Moses did not learn of the name of God until Exodus 3:14, and then later when he proclaimed that he was the Lord later in Exodus. So the name Jochebed is interesting because, of course, the Israelites did not necessarily know who their God was. And Moses, when he came and revealed this name, he had to show through miracles that the Lord had actually sent him. And he also asked, what is your name? Which kind of proves the fact that Moses and the people didn't have the name anymore. The way we explain this is Genesis 4:26. The mistranslation in Genesis 4:26 is it didn't say the people during the days of Enosh proclaimed the name of the Lord. It said the people during the days of Enosh profaned the name of the Lord. The Hebrew word you need to look at is the word shalal. It can mean proclaim, but it can also mean to pollute or defile. And if we take a look at the 1611 King James Bible, the original, you'll find in the original, which you can find on archive.org, in the side notes, it specifically says that King James, when he was, or at least the translators, when they wrote this out, they were uncertain whether the name was proclaim, the word was proclaim or profane. The reason why is because in some texts, you'll actually see that they were using the name of the Lord as a method of idol worship. In other words, the people were calling themselves by the name of the Lord and making themselves into idols. And this was before the flood. So then we can see Amram and Jochebed, which again has the name of the Lord in her name, gave birth to Aaron and Moses and Miriam. Moses and Aaron, this is where a lot of the story of Exodus is centered around. Moses was to be God to Pharaoh and Aaron his prophet. We saw the first plague, which was blood in the river Nile. The second plague, an infestation of frogs. The third plague, swarms of gnats. The fourth plague, masses of flies. We can also see the translation as insects, so we don't know exactly what type of insects these were, but in the story often you'll see the word flies. It could be any insect. The fifth plague, the death of all livestock. The sixth plague, disease or boils. And if you research the Pharaoh Thutmose III, during his time alive, his family seemed to have boils and disease, which would fit along the lines as to when Moses would have crossed the Red Sea. The seventh plague, storm and giant hail. The eighth plague, a plague of locusts. The ninth plague, which was a plague of darkness. And it's interesting when you look at the ninth plague and the 10th plague. The 10th plague we know is the death of the firstborn children. But of course, we know that Christ was the Son of God. And so before Christ died on the cross, the land went dark. And of course, as I mentioned, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn sons. Then we had the Exodus from Egypt. We'll now start our overview of Exodus chapters 37 to 40. Starting with Exodus chapter 37. When we take a look at Exodus 37, we're taking a look at the tabernacle. The tabernacle is also called the tent of meeting or the sanctuary. So when you see these words used in the Bible, you can use them interchangeably. They're synonyms. So tabernacle or sanctuary or tent of meeting. This was this tent that we see that was composed of the holy place and the holiest of holies where the Ark of the Covenant was. And then this outward area that went around this tent, this was the courtyard. So in this chapter, we took a look at the items that were inside the temple, items such as the Holy of Holies, which was in the holy place where the Ark was. We have the Ark of the Covenant, also called the Ark of the Testimony. There was a veil separating the two sides of this tent. We had the Altar of Incense, the lampstand, also known as the Menorah in Hebrew. When you read about it in English, it will always say the golden lampstand, but if you translate it into the Hebrew, you'll see the word menorah. The word Hanukkah is something totally different. We've studied this before, where we saw that the Hanukkah candles, there's actually more than 7 candles, but we'll take a look at that shortly. There's the holy place, which was the area that the priests would go, and we'll look at those objects shortly. We had the table of showbread, and we had an outer veil. And if you take a look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the size approximation. If you take a look, you'll see an American football field, which is 100 yards. And then if you take a look, you can see the court of the tabernacle. So really what we're looking at is around something along the lines of maybe a sixth of a football field. Details of Exodus 37. We look at constructing the ark, the mercy seat, the table of showbread, the lampstand, the altar of incense. So this chapter is actually a lot like a previous chapter, but the difference is this. In the prior chapter, Moses was receiving the instructions. In this chapter, it's actually being built. So Exodus 25 is when Moses receives the instructions to build the ark. Exodus 37 is describing the actual building of the ark. Remember, Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. That's Exodus 25. So the 10 Commandments, those were placed inside of the Ark of the Covenant, also known as the Ark of the Testimony. Hebrews 9 and 4, containing the golden altar of incense and the gold-covered Ark of the Covenant. Inside the ark were the gold jar of manna, Aaron's staff that had budded, and the stone tablets of the covenant. So Hebrews is much farther into the Bible, but we can see here that the 2 tablets of stone, these were placed inside of the Ark of the Covenant. So this is the Ark of the Covenant. We can see 2 cherubim facing each other. We can see the poles that's made of acacia wood. And the Ark of the Covenant itself was made of wood, but then painted with gold. However, we'll take a look at a second at the mercy seat, which was slightly different. In Exodus 37 and 5, it reads, "Then he made poles of acacia wood and overlaid them with gold. He inserted the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark in order to carry it." So the ark itself was made of wood, and then it was overlaid with gold, except for one piece. And only the Levites were allowed to carry the Ark of the Covenant. So whenever they had to pack up the tent and they would move because they were in the wilderness for 40 years, the Levites were the only ones that were allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant resided inside of the tabernacle. And of course, we saw the tabernacle has a couple different names. It's also called the sanctuary or the tent of meeting. So if you take a look, here's the cardinal points. It's very important to understand the cardinal points as well. West was where the Ark of the Covenant was. That's the holiest of holies. So if you're facing God, that means you're facing towards the west. The entrance was in the east. Towards the north is where you'll find the table of showbread. So if you were walking straight towards the west, on your right-hand side would be the table of showbread. On your left-hand side would be the golden lampstand. And then directly toward the west, in front of the veil, on the other side of the veil from the holiest of holies, you had the altar of incense. And that would typically be where Aaron, the high priest, or one of his descendants operating as a high priest, would be burning incense. And then you can see in the outside, we had the courtyard of the tabernacle, and you can see there was a bronze laver and an altar for burnt offering. So the animal sacrifices happened on the outside. Here's another image of the inside. So again, we can see the golden lampstand. Also in Hebrew, it's called the Menorah. That is on the left-hand side or on the south side. And then on the north side, we had the Table of Showbread, which is golden utensils. And then we can see the Altar of Incense towards the west. It's separated by a curtain with cherubim on it. On the other side of that curtain, on the other side of the veil, that's the Ark of the Covenant. And then God would reside on top of an area called the mercy seat. So God would sit above the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant. Inside of that Ark of the Covenant is where the Ten Commandments would be found. Here's another image. You can see it was covered with goat's hair, ram skin. Where it says badger's skin, it could also be a porpoise, because the translation denotes that this skin is some kind of a leather. And it could very well be when they crossed the Red Sea, they found whale skin or porpoise skin, and that was the outer covering. But that's not as important as just understanding that there were different animals that composed the outer covering of this sanctuary. Now, this is the mercy seat. The mercy seat was made of pure gold, this top area here. This is where the Lord's presence, his glory, would reside. This was the only piece that was made of solid gold. The rest was wood that was painted gold, overlaid with gold. Exodus 37:9. And the cherubim had wings that spread upward, overshadowing the mercy seat. The cherubim faced each other, looking toward the mercy seat. Now we're going to take a look at the Table of Showbread. As I mentioned, if you are walking in from the east, walking towards the west, it would be on your right-hand side, which would be the north part of this this tent of meeting. The Table of Showbread, the edge of it was 1 hand breadth. So of course they had different measurements back then. A hand breadth is approximately the width of your hair, the width of your hand. And so you can see here, it was overlain with gold. It had poles to be carried as well. This again was wood overlain with gold, and the utensils were made of gold. Exodus 37:10-12. He also made the table of acacia wood, 2 cubits long, a cubit wide, and a cubit and a half high. He overlaid it with pure gold and made a gold molding around it. And he made a rim around it a handbreadth wide and put a gold molding on the rim. Now we're going to take a look at the golden lampstand, also known as the menorah. It is not the Hanukkah. That is something different. There are 7 candles on the menorah, or the golden lampstand. When you're reading the Old Testament and the New Testament, you're not going to see the word menorah, but you will see the lampstand or the golden lampstand, or the candlestick sometimes. The golden lampstand. The menorah is translated as golden lampstand throughout the Bible. I point that out because in one study, I thought menorah was not in the Bible. It actually is. It's just in Hebrew. It's the word behind the word lampstand. So lampstand is menorah. It is all throughout the Bible, translated in English, though, typically as the lampstand or golden lampstand. And you'll see here you've got 3 candles on the right, or 3 holders on the right, 3 holders on the left, and then the center at the base, they're all connected to that one base. Exodus 37:17-18. Then he made the lampstand. This is where you'll see the word menorah, out of pure hammered gold, all of one piece. So again, when we take a look, the mercy seat was made of pure gold. This menorah, this lampstand was also made of pure gold, all one piece. Its base and shaft, its cups and its buds and petals. 6 branches extended from the sides, 3 on one side and 3 on the other. So just reading this here, we can see that if we have a center piece, a base, and there's 3 extending on one side and 3 extending on the other, there is no room for any other number than 7. There are 7. Exodus 37:23-24. He also made it 7 lamps. So again, you would have 7 lamps because you would have 7 places, obviously, to place a lamp. So if you see a menorah or a Hanukkah with more lamps than what's supposed to be there, it's not at all following the Bible in Exodus. He also made its 7 lamps, its wick trimmers and trays of pure gold. He made the lampstand and all the utensils from a talent of pure gold. The golden candlestand has 7 lamps. Menorah, again, is translated as lampstand in English. The altar of incense. So the altar of incense was on the other side of the veil, across from the Holy of Holies, across from the Ark of the Covenant, divided with this veil. The horns on the altar were made of one piece, and again, it was covered with gold. Exodus 37:25-26. He made the altar of incense out of acacia wood. It was a square, a cubit long, a cubit wide, and 2 cubits high. Its horns were of one piece, and he overlaid it with pure gold, and on the top and all the sides and the horns. Then he made a molding of gold around it. So far, all the objects that we've explored that are inside of the tent of meeting, they are objects that are either solid gold, like we saw in the case of the menorah, the candlesticks, or the mercy seat, but at least everything in there is overlain with gold if it's not solid gold. The tabernacle was a small based copy of what is in heaven. So the reason why I think you're seeing the description of what's inside of the tabernacle or the sanctuary or the tent of meeting is because this tent is actually a small model of what's in heaven. So in heaven, you're going to see this. It's going to be set up exactly like this. And you can tell because these objects are mentioned like this in Revelation, except when you're dealing with them in Revelation, these objects are not denoting something on the earth. These objects are being denoted as something up above. Revelation 9:13. Then the 6th angel sounded his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar before God. So the golden altar before God in Revelation 9:13, this is not taking place on earth. That means that what Moses had, which was originally this moving tabernacle, which eventually was made into the Temple of Solomon, and later rebuilt after the Babylon captivity as Herod's temple or Zerubbabel's temple. This temple, which is now destroyed, it no longer exists on earth. This temple exists up in heaven. So what was going on earth was just a micro scale of what was going on in heaven. So everything inside of this temple or tent of meeting was made of gold, or at least coated with gold. We looked at the candlesticks, the altar of incense, the showbread, or the table with the showbread on it. And then when there was a veil, and on the other side of the veil, we had the most holy place with the Ark of the Covenant. These objects were all gold. Exodus 37 overview. Bezalel made the arks out of acacia wood. It is 2 cubits in length and 1.5 cubits wide and tall. The ark was overlaid with pure gold inside and out, and has gold moldings around it, and had 4 rings of gold for its 4 feet. 2 rings on one side and 2 on the other. The ark was carried with poles made out of wood, which were overlaid with gold and put on each side into the rings. On top, the ark sat the mercy seat, which was made of pure gold. 2 cherubs were placed on each side of the mercy seat, facing each other, toward the mercy seat with their wings spread to overshadow the mercy seat. Bezalel made the table of showbread out of acacia wood. It was 2 cubits in length, 1 cubit wide, and 1.5 cubits tall. The table was overlaid with pure gold, and a molding of gold is around it. He made a rim around it, a handbreadth wide, with a molding of gold around the rim. The table had 4 rings of gold cast to the 4 corners of each of the legs. The rings were close to the frames as holders for the poles to carry the table. On the table was a vessel made of pure gold, as well as utensils such as plates, dishes for incense, bowls to pour the drink offerings. Bezalel made a lampstand of pure gold, the menorah, as well as its utensils. The lampstand was made of 6 branches out of the sides of the base, 3 branches from one side and 3 from the other, so again, 7. The 3 cups on each side were shaped like almond blossoms, and each had a calyx and a flower on the branches. On the lampstand itself, the center base, were 4 cups, like almond blossoms, with calyxes and flowers, and the calyx was one piece, and under its pair of the 6 branches going out of it. In total, the lampstand, menorah in Hebrew, had 7 lamps, and its tongs and its trays were made of pure gold. Bezalel made the altar of incense out of acacia wood. overlaid in pure gold at its top and around its side and its horns, as well as its molding. It is a cubit in length and width and 2 cubits tall. It was a square, and its horns are of one piece. Bezaleel made 2 rings of gold on it, under its molding, and put on opposite sides as holders for poles to carry it. The poles were made of acacia wood overlaid with gold. Now we're going to move on to Exodus 38. In Exodus 38, we examined the items on the outside of the tent of meeting. So we're going to look at the bronze altar, the bronze basin, the courtyard, and then we're going to look at the inventory for the tabernacle. That's what happened in this chapter. So now we're not dealing with the inside of the temple or the inside of the tabernacle. We're looking at the outer part. So this outer part here, as I mentioned, is called the courtyard, the court of the tabernacle. We can see the tables are there for slaughtering. We can see the brazen altar, so the bronze altar, and we can see the brazen laver or the bronze laver. So these are the 2 objects on the outside. We have the washing basin, and then we have this area for sacrifice, and then we have the slaughter tables. So again, we're going to focus first on the bronze laver and the bronze altar. The bronze altar was used for the animal sacrifice. So when they were burning the animals and their offerings, this would happen on the bronze laver. The bronze altar, my apologies, the bronze altar. The brazen laver or the bronze laver was where they would wash. So the priests, before they could enter inside the tent of meeting, they had to cleanse themselves. They had to wash themselves. So we can see here that the high priest, Aaron, is getting his feet washed. There are obviously other high priests aside from Aaron, but this would be typical that if you're going to go into the tent of meeting, there is a certain amount of cleansing that you need to do before you could actually enter. You have to remember that when Moses, he encountered the burning bush, he had to take off his sandals as it was holy ground. Well, here we're going into holy ground because, of course, inside of the tent of meeting, that was a place that no one could go except for the priests. Specifically, the high priest would be the one going in here. The other sons, for the most part, would be working on the outside of this tent. So notice this. The outer objects were all made of bronze. The inner objects were all made of gold. So when we take a look at the tent of meeting or the sanctuary or whatever name you want to use, this inner area was all made of objects either solid gold or coated with gold. But when we take a look at the outer objects, these objects were bronze. So the outer area, this outer area is called the courtyard. So we have the tabernacle, the sanctuary, or the area that's on the outside is called the courtyard. Exodus 38 and 21. Moses records an inventory. This is the inventory for the tabernacle of the testimony, as recorded at Moses' command by the Levites under the direction of Ithamar, the son of Aaron, the priest. So they take an inventory of everything because, of course, they were given instructions first from the Lord to Moses as to how to build these objects and how to build the sanctuary. And then later we see Moses taking an inventory of everything. However, we see there was this time called the Conquest of Babylon. So Babylon had conquered Israel. The southern kingdom was conquered. Their temple was destroyed. Later in time, though, they were returned back. And this we can see in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So the book of Ezra and Nehemiah talks about when the Jews had returned back from Babylon and came back to Jerusalem. You have to remember that the Babylon exile was before the people were exiled, their temple was destroyed. So the exile happened over a series of years. The people were taken from Jerusalem, brought into Babylon, and the story behind that was they started following other gods, like the northern kingdom did as well. And then their temple was destroyed. In the book of Ezra, we also see an inventory. In Second Ezra 68 and 70, when they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, so in other words, when they came back from Babylon, some of the heads of the families gave freewill offerings to rebuild the house of God on its original site. So there have been 2 temples. There was the moving tabernacle first that we saw in the wilderness. Then there was Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was destroyed when there was the Babylonian captivity. And now we see in the book of Ezra, they're trying to rebuild it on the original site. So the families, the heads of families, were giving offerings to try to rebuild what they once had. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for this work 61,000 derricks of gold, 5,000 minas of silver, and 100 priestly garments. So they're doing the same thing that we can see back in the book of Exodus, where basically they're trying to come up with resources for inventory to replace what was destroyed. So the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants, along with some of the people, settled in their own towns, and the rest of the Israelites settled in their towns. Exodus 38 overview. Bezalel made the altar of burnt offerings of acacia wood, 5 cubits in length and wide, 3 cubits tall. The altar was designed to be square, hollow with boards, and covering that was a network of bronze under its ledge, which extended halfway down. So again, we're seeing this trend of we have something that's made of acacia wood, and then the acacia wood is coated with a metal. And in this case, it was bronze because it was on the outside of the sanctuary. The altar had horns placed at the 4 corners, which were one piece and were overlaid with bronze. Bezalel made all the utensils, pots, shovels, basins, forks, and fire pans of bronze. Poles were made of acacia wood and overlaid with bronze, which he put through rings on the side of the altar to carry. Bezalel made a bronze basin and its stand bronze from the mirrors of ministering women who ministered in the entrance of the tent of meeting. So we can see that outside the tent of meeting here, we have women at the entrance and they were ministering. Bezalel made the court, and all hangings were made of fine twined linens. On the south side, the hangings of the course were made of twined linen measuring 100 cubits and 20 pillars and bases of bronze, but the hooks of the pillars were silver. On the north side, there were hangings of 100 cubits and of 20 pillars and bases of bronze, and the hooks were silver. On the front of the east, it was 50 cubits, and the hangings for one side of the gate were 15 cubits, and their 3 pillars in their bases. The other side was the same. The overlaying of the capitals of the pillars were also silver, and all the pillars of the court were attached with silver. The screen for the gate of the court was embroidered with a needlework in blue, purple, and scarlet yarn with fine twined linen, and it was 20 cubits long, 5 cubits wide, corresponding to the hangings of the court. There were 4 pillars, and the 4 bases were bronze, and their hooks silver, and overlaid with the capital attached with silver. The pegs for the tabernacle for the court were of bronze. The tabernacle was to be the responsibility of the Levites under the direction of Ithamar, the son of Aaron, the priest. Bezalel made all the Lord had commanded to make with Oliab, the son of Ahijamach from the tribe of Dan. All the gold made in the construction of the sanctuary was 29 talents and 730 shekels. The silver of all of the congregation was 1,775 shekels, a beka head, which is half a shekel, for everyone who were listed in the records from 20 years and older for 600,000 and 3,500 men. So basically, you had to give an offering once you were 20 years old. 100 talents of silver for casting the bases of the sanctuary and the veil, 10 talents per base. 1,775 shekels made the hooks for the pillars. The bronze was 2,400 shekels, which was offered and made the basis for the entrance of the tent of meeting, the bronze altar and the bronze grating. It was also used to make all the utensils of the altar, the bases around the court, the bases of the gate of the court, all the pegs of the tabernacle, and all the pegs around the court. Exodus 39. In Exodus 39, the details we see are the ephod, the breastpiece, we see additional priestly garments, and then Moses reviews the completed work. So we can see in the previous chapters, there was all this building, and then here at the end, we see that Moses is reviewing all the work that has been done. So first off, what is an ephod? We saw an ephod for the first time a couple chapters back when Moses first received the instructions for what the priests were to wear. The ephod is basically like an apron worn by the high priest, and we can see that because in Exodus 39:4, we're told so. The description sounds like an apron. They made shoulder pieces for the ephod, which were attached at 2 of its corners, so it could be fastened. And skillfully woven waistband of the ephod was of one piece with the ephod, of the same workmanship, with gold, with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn. and with finely spun linen, just as the Lord commanded Moses. So what we're seeing described here in Exodus 39, it sounds a lot like it's an apron. At least that's the design, with the straps on the top, and then we have the band that goes around the waist. The next piece we're going to look at is the breastpiece of judgment. In Exodus 39, 8 to 13, which parallels with Exodus 28, that's where we first see the ephod and we see the breastpiece. It says, he made the breastpiece with the same workmanship as the ephod, with gold, with blue, with purple, with scarlet yarn, and finely spun linen. It was square when folded over double, and span long and a span wide. And they mounted on it 4 rows of gemstones. The first row had a ruby, a topaz, and an emerald. The second row had a turquoise, a sapphire, and a diamond. The third row had a jacinth, an agate, and an amethyst. The fourth row had beryl, an onyx, and a jasper. These stones were mounted in gold filigree settings. If you actually take a look here, you can see in the top corners of where this ephod was, where this breastpiece was. The breastpiece, it basically connected to the ephod, and it didn't swing around, it stayed steady. But we can see in the 2 corners onyx stones, and those were on the shoulders. They mounted the onyx stones in gold filigree settings, engraved like a seal, with the names of the sons of Israel. So the names of the sons of Israel appeared on these onyx stones. Then they fastened them on the shoulder pieces of the ephod as a memorial stone for the sons of Israel, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Exodus 39 and 14 reads, the 12 stones corresponded to the names of the sons of Israel. Each stone was engraved like a seal with the name of one of the 12 tribes. So these stones that we saw that composed the 4 rows, we saw 3 stones in 4 rows. 3 times 4 gives you 12. There were 12 tribes of Israel. Each stone corresponded to a tribe. So what this was, this type of engraving, it's called an intaglio. An engraved gem, frequently referred to as an intaglio, is a small and usually semi-precious gemstone that has been carved in Western tradition, normally with images or inscriptions only on one face. This wasn't something just done by the Jews or the Israelites. This was something also done by the Romans. I believe the Greeks did this as well. The high priest and his sons. So we can see the high priest on the right. We can see how the sons dressed on the left. You see the difference between the high priest and the sons? There was a couple actually, but one of the biggest pieces was the breastplate, which sat on top of the ephod, which was like the apron. Exodus 39 and 27. For Aaron and his sons, they made tunics of fine linen, the work of a weaver, as well as the turban of fine linen, and the ornate headbands of the undergarments of finely spun linen. Why do they wear undergarments? Because when they went to go do the sacrifices, or they went towards the altar, they couldn't walk up somewhere where their nudity would be exposed. It was shameful. That's why specifically they had underwear. Not everyone back then wore underwear. And the sash of finely spun linen, embroidered with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. So you can clearly tell who was the high priest. The high priest stood out quite a bit. And notice that the high priest did not wear red. The high priest wore blue. So when you see, for example, at the Vatican, these priests are dressing completely opposite to how the high priests are described in Exodus. And of course, we know when we look later in the Bible, we see that there is a child called Esau or Edom, and it speaks about Esau or Edom. Why are your robes stained crimson? Why are they red? The Levites were sons of Aaron. They were chosen priests. They were the chosen priesthood for all generations. So there was not supposed to be anyone else operating as a priest. Basically, the Levitical priesthood is done. It was done. Christ was the last priest. He was the high priest. He was both priest and king. When you study the Bible very carefully, you can see that Christ played 2 roles. In Revelation, you can clearly see he is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. But Christ is also our high priest. So he serves us as both priest and king. We don't have high priests anymore that serve us on earth. What's going on in Israel is not supposed to be happening. There is no more Levites to be doing these sacrifices. They shouldn't be. Christ was that final sacrifice on the cross. He was the perfect sacrifice. Animal sacrifice ended with Christ on the cross. Or it should have. Exodus 28 and 43. Aaron and his sons must wear them whenever they enter the tent of meeting or approach the altar to minister in the holy place, so that they will not incur guilt and die. Remember, the priests and the priest's sons were the only ones that were allowed to go into the tent of meeting. And there are parts of the Bible where there are individuals that go into the tent of meeting they aren't supposed to, and they die immediately. So not only did they have to prepare themselves, sanctify themselves, wash themselves before they went in with this washing basin, they had to be dressed a certain way, and they had to be Levites. And it says specifically in Exodus 28 and 43, this is to be a permanent statute for Aaron and his descendants. So no one else was supposed to be taking on this role. So then near the end of the chapter, we see that Moses approves the works of the craftsmen. This is talking about what was going on the outside. This is the courtyard with the laver and the altar of burnt offering. These objects were made of bronze. And then on the inside, we looked at pieces like the golden lampstand, the table of the showbread, also known as the bread of presence, the incense altar, the Ark of the Covenant, or the Ark of the Testimony. These things were all examined by Moses in Exodus 39 to 33 to 43, and they got his stamp of approval. They were made to standard, as the Lord commanded. Then we have our overview of Exodus 39. The craftsmen made the holy garments for Aaron to minister in the holy place, as the Lord commanded Moses, out of blue, purple, and scarlet yarns woven into garments. The ephod is made of gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns, and finely twinned linen. A gold leaf was hammered and cut into threads to work into the blue, purple, and scarlet yarns in a skilled design. Shoulder pieces were attached to the ephod to join the two edges, woven with gold, blue, porpoise, and scarlet yarn. They made onyx stones enclosed in the settings of gold and engraved like a signet according to the names of the sons of Israel. So each one of those stones represented one of the sons. It was square, and it was set on shoulder pieces of the ephod to be stones of remembrance for the sons of Israel. As a matter of fact, in the book of Revelation, when you see Zion, right, when you see heaven, you'll notice that there are pillars and that there are markings on heaven itself where it has the names of the sons of Israel, the different tribes. They set groups of 3 columns with 4 rows of stone on top of each other. A row of sardius, topaz, carbuncle, the first row emerald, sapphire, diamond, second row jacinth, agate, amethyst, third row beryl, onyx, jasper, and the fourth row. 12 stones in total, with their names according to the names of the sons of Israel. They made a breastpiece twisted of chains like a cord of pure gold. The settings of gold and 2 gold rings and 2 rings of the edges of the 2 edges of the breastpiece, and they placed the 2 cords of the gold in the 2 rings. They attached the 2 ends of the 2 cords of the 2 settings, and they attached it from the front of the ephod. So basically, the breastpiece was attached to the ephod, and it was giving you the description of how exactly the ephod was not swinging around. It was firmly attached to the high priest. There were also 2 gold rings placed on the inside edge next to the ephod, and 2 rings attached to the front lower part of the shoulder pieces of the ephod, as its seam above the woven band of the ephod. The breastplate was bound by its rings to the rings of the ephod with a lace of blue, so it would lie on the women band of the ephod. The breastpiece should not come loose from the ephod. The robe of the ephod was made of all blue, and the opening of the robe had a binding so it would not tear. The hem of the robe had pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and bells of pure gold were put in between the pomegranates, so they alternated. The bells were on the priest, so that way, if the priest would walk into the tent of meeting, of course, other people can go in there. So if the priest was to die, you wouldn't hear the bells sound anymore. The coat, the turban, caps, sash, and undergarments were made of fine twined linen of blue, purple, and scarlet yarn embroidered with needlework. A plate was made of holy crown of pure gold that had the inscription, Holy to the Lord, engraved on it. And this is interesting because this word holy to the Lord, it shows up in North America with the Native American Indians who are not native to North America. They had this inscription, holiness to the Lord, actually engraved on some of the objects that they left behind. And they actually had spoken block Hebrew. It says it was tied to a cord of blue and fastened to the turban. Then they brought the tabernacle to Moses, according to all the Lord had commanded them to build, and Moses blessed them. Now we're moving on to Exodus 40. In Exodus 40, we look at the setting up of the tabernacle and the cloud and the glory. Exodus 41-3. Then the Lord said to Moses, on the first day of the first month, you are to set up a tabernacle, the tent of meeting. Put the ark of the testimony in it, and screen off the ark with the veil. So what was the first day of the first month? When's the first month? The first month is the month of Nisan. Originally it was called Abib. So after the Assyrian captivity, there was a god called Nisan. They named this calendar day after Nisan. So the first month of the year corresponds roughly to March, April. March, April is when the month of Nisan extends into, but it would be in March. It would be in March going by the Gregorian calendar. So the new year isn't in January. According to the Bible, the new year is in March. And if we take a look here, we can see all the other biblical holidays. Here's the Ark of the Covenant. And inside the Ark of the Covenant, we can also see that here are the 10 Commandments, but we can also see Aaron's rod, and we can see the manna. Here we can see the tent of meeting, or the sanctuary, or the tabernacle. And again, this is this final piece that was made. This was made on the first month of the year, on the first day of the year. That's when it was set up for the first time. Exodus 40:34-36. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses was unable to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Whenever the cloud was lifted from above the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out through all the stages of their journey. So, of course, earlier in Exodus, we saw when they were leaving Egypt, they were guided by a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. Exodus 13:21 reads, the Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud. He provided light at night with a pillar of fire. So here we can see when this cloud would descend, or this cloud would ascend off of the top of the tent of meeting, they would pack everything up. The Levites would grab the Ark of the Covenant, and then they would move around again in the wilderness. Keep in mind, this went on for 40 years. This went on for 40 years until the older generation was no longer around. Then all the children were the ones that came in the days of Joshua, or the time of Joshua when he won these conquests. The children were the ones that saw the land of Canaan, the promised land. None of the adults that came from Egypt got to see the promised land. They all died in the wilderness. At nighttime, they didn't follow a pillar of cloud. That was during the day in the scorching heat of the sun. In the nighttime, they followed a pillar of fire. So this was their path roughly in the wilderness. A lot of scholars, it's disagreements, but this is the rough path. So they came from Egypt, from Ramses. And then you can see this area called Succoth. Succoth actually is when we have this festival, the Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, when you would go into a tent. So it's kind of interesting to see one of the first places on their journey when they left Egypt was called Sukkot, and Sukkot has to do with being in tents. And so then we see that they spend this time in the wilderness. They spend 40 years pretty much going in circles in the wilderness. It does not take you 40 years to get through this area. And we know this because when Abraham and Lot came into Egypt, it did not take them 40 years to make this journey. Exodus 40. The Lord commanded that on the first day of the first month, Nisan or Abib, originally the name was Abib, that they shall erect the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and put in it the ark of the testimony, with the golden altar for incense before the ark of the testimony, and screen the ark with the veil. So basically, between the ark of the testimony, the ark of the covenant, and the incense, there was a curtain that went in between, a veil. The table is to be arranged as well as the lampstands, and the screen for the door of the tabernacle are to be erected. The altar of the burnt offering was to be set before the door of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting, and the basin was to be put between the tent of meeting and the altar with water in it. The court was to be set up all around, and a screen hung up at the gate of the court. The anointing oil was to be used to anoint the tabernacle and all that was in it, and consecrate it and all of its furniture. so that it may become holy. The basin and its stand are to be consecrated. Aaron and his sons were brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting and washed with water. Aaron was to be put in holy garments, and he shall be anointed and consecrated that he may serve as a priest to the Lord. The sons of Aaron were to have a coat put on them, and to be anointed just as Aaron was, so they could serve the Lord as priests. Aaron and his sons were to serve as priests as a perpetual statute for all generations, so no other tribes, no one else could be a priest. Moses did all the Lord commanded in the second year on the first day of the first month. The bases were laid and set up with its frames and put up with its poles and raised on its pillars. He spread the tent over the tabernacle and put the covering of the tent over it. The testimony was put in the ark, and the poles into the ark with the mercy seat above it on the ark. The ark was brought into the tabernacle and set behind the veil. The table of showbread was in the tent of meeting and placed on the north side of the tabernacle. So if you're facing the west, it's on your right side, outside the veil, and the bread arranged on it before the Lord. The lampstand was placed in the tent of meeting, opposite to the table on the south side of the tabernacle. So in other words, the left if you're facing the west. The golden altar in the tent of meeting before the veil, and burned fragrant incense on it. And this incense could not be replicated or used by anything else except for the specific temple service. The screen was placed for the door of the tabernacle, and the altar of burnt offering at the entrance of the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. On that altar was offered burnt offerings and grain offerings. The basin was placed between the tent of meeting and the altar, and water was placed in it for washing, which Moses, Aaron, and his sons washed their hands and feet with when they went into the tent and they approached the altar. The court was placed around the tabernacle, and the altar and the screen set up at the gate of the court. When Moses entered the tent of meeting, a cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. So at this point, Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it. Through all of their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, the people would follow it. The cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle during the day, and it became fire by night. This was the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. So the whole time they journeyed through the wilderness, they would see either this pillar of fire in the evening, or they'd see this pillar of cloud, and this would be on top of the Ark of the Testimony, were on top of the holy place. So they would see this coming out of the tent. Bonus content, the budding staff. When we look at the Ark of the Covenant, we later find it wasn't just the 10 Commandments that were inside of the Ark of the Covenant. We find that there was also manna, and this was something left behind that they could prove to later generations that the Lord would provide. So the Israelites would know in the future that the Lord would provide for you no matter what. They placed the manna inside of here so that way the people would know when they were in the wilderness and they had no food, the Lord made manna rain down from heaven. The other thing that was found in here was a staff, and this was Aaron's staff, Aaron's rod. Each tribal leader of the 12 tribes had to have a rod. This would show that they were the chief of the tribe. But this particular rod, keep in mind, it was a staff, and the staff was separated from a tree. So it's strange to see a rod that's separated from a tree that's budding with blossoms. Aaron's staff was also later stored in the ark. As I mentioned, each tribal leader had a staff. And you can see Aaron's staff was the only staff that blossomed. Everyone else just had a dead stick. Number 17, the budding staff and Korah's rebellion. And the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and take from them 12 staffs, one from the leader of each tribe. Write each man's name on the staff," that way you can identify them. "And write Aaron's name on the staff of Levi, because there must be one staff for the head of each tribe. Place the staffs in the tent of meeting in front of the testimony where I meet with you. The staff belonging to the man I choose will sprout, and I will rid myself of the constant grumbling of the Israelites against you." Let me give you some context. In the previous chapter, what you're seeing is, if you remember the golden calf, when Moses had came down and seen this golden calf, basically what you had was you had a group of people, and they were trying to rebel, and they were trying to go in a different direction, and they were not recognizing the Levitical priests. Number 17 is speaking about what happened after this. So Moses spoke to the Israelites, and each of their leaders gave him a staff, each for one of the leaders of their tribes. 12 staffs in all, and Aaron's staff was among them. Then Moses placed the staffs before the Lord in the tent of the testimony. The next day Moses entered the tent of the testimony and saw that Aaron's staff, representing the house of Levi, had sprouted, put forth buds, blossomed, and produced almonds. So imagine this. You have a series of staffs. Each tribal leader had a staff. Only one staff sprouted. Obviously, that was the staff that was chosen. Normally, I've never seen a stick that's been removed from a tree or a branch removed from a tree. I haven't seen it blossom. This was a miracle. It goes on in verse 9 and says, Then Moses brought out all the staffs from the Lord's presence to the Israelites. They saw them, and each man took his own staff. Remember, their names were on it. The Lord said to Moses, Put Aaron's staff back in front of the testimony to be kept as a sign for the rebellious, so that you may put an end to their grumbling against me, lest they die. In other words, now it's known who is selected, who is chosen by the Lord, because this was the staff that blossomed. That means if there was any more infighting, anyone else who thinks that they're going to be a priest, anyone else that they thought that they were going to serve God, it's been very clear who God selected. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. Then the Israelites declared to Moses, Look, we are perishing. We are lost. We are all lost. So at this point, the people knew. They thought in their own minds. They believed that they knew God. This act showed that no, the Levites knew God and they knew what God desired. They were the ones appointed to do the service inside this tent of meeting. The others recognized at this point, seeing this miracle, we know nothing. We're dying. We're lost. We're confused. We're stupid. Anyone who comes near the tabernacle of the Lord will die. Are we all going to perish? So at this point, they go from rebellion in chapter 16, seeing this miracle and seeing who God chose to be his priests, reaffirming who God chose to be his priests. And at that point, the rebellion crushed. Why were the others perishing? Why did they recognize that they were perishing? What did this blossoming rod represent? Sure, it represented who was chosen to lead as a priest, but there was more to it than that. John 15:1-8. Now we're looking at the New Testament, book of John, right? The gospel. I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they'll produce even more. Think about this. You had 12 tribal leaders, only one blossomed. So here we can see Christ calls himself the vine. And we can see that any trees that don't produce fruit, what happens to them? Well, you get rid of them, right? You don't keep a tree that doesn't produce fruit. So what were those people realizing in the book of Numbers? We're not producing any fruit. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me and I'll remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine. So for example, if you have a tree branch and you separate it from the tree, it's not going to produce fruit anymore. But here we're seeing that if you remain in Christ, it's different. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. In other words, if you don't know Christ, if you are not in Christ, you can think in your own mind that you are a person of good works, a person of good actions. But in the Father's eyes, no, you're nothing. You're a dead branch. Yes, this is Christ speaking. Yes, I am the vine. You are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. In other words, you can think in your own mind that you can do it without God. You can do it without Christ. The truth of the matter is, you can't do anything without him. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Now you understand back in the book of Numbers why they were scared. Why are we perishing? You're perishing because you thought you knew God, but you don't know God. Such branches are gathered into a pile to be burned. Isn't that what you do with dead branches? You know, in the fall maybe, you take all the branches, you clean them off the tree, and you prune them. What do? You either throw them in the garbage, or back in the day, what would you do? You have a bonfire. You take all the dead branches and you burn them in the bonfire. So what was the risk of all these people in the book of Numbers? They thought they knew God. They didn't know God. They found out, I'm just a dead branch. Whereas the Levites, these priests, they knew God. They had fruits. They had a branch that's blossoming. It's a miracle. Please, we don't want to perish. We don't want to be thrown in the fire. Then it goes on and says, but if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great glory to my Father. Let's look at 2 Peter 2, 1-3, because this is actually talking about what's going on back in the book of Numbers. But false prophets also arose among the people. They shared it in the book of Numbers. Those people thought they knew what they were doing. Just as there will be false teachers among you who will be secretly bringing in destructive heresies, in other words, teachings that will lead to your death, even denying the master that bought them. Who's the master? Christ. Christ is the Lord. So why does it say that Christ bought them? Because you're slaves to sin and you had to be ransomed. The ransom was his blood. You didn't even know that Christ was God when this ransom was paid. You probably didn't accept him. You probably laughed at the whole idea of someone dying on the cross and resurrecting, but whatever, you were still bought. Bringing upon themselves swift destruction. So in other words, those who deny the master, what comes to them? Destruction. Just like in the book of Numbers, they weren't following God. They thought they were. They thought they had fruits. They realized we have no good works. And what were they scared of? They knew that those branches, those dead sticks, were going to be thrown in the fire. And many will follow their sensuality. And because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. In other words, they'll follow their feelings. They won't do what God says. They won't care what God says. They'll look at the Bible, they'll scoff, they'll just pretend it's irrelevant. It's not important. I'm going to do it my way, and God will still accept me. And here he says, no. And many will follow their sensuality. And because of them, the way of truth will be blasphemed. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. So in other words, they'll try to come up with words to match how they feel. There's nothing in the Bible that explains what they're doing aside from they feel a certain way, they think God will accept them regardless, and they try to explain it with words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. In other words, from the very beginning, they were already written in the book of death. They were never written in the book of life. It was predetermined. Yes, people obviously make their own decisions, but the Father has the ability to know ahead of time who's in the book of life and who's in the book of death. 2 Peter 2 and 4, it's very interesting when you see what goes on here, because now it starts to connect what some of the ideologies, where they were coming from. It says, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent them to hell, putting them in chains of darkness to be held for judgment. I know a lot of churches don't know this line, and they're probably confused by it. When did angels sin? And they're thinking, oh, okay, well, that must have been, when Satan had his rebellion. Well, you have to remember, there's Genesis 6:4. In Genesis 6:4, angels and women, sons of God and women, they came together and they made children. These are the angels that sinned. How do we know that? The next line will tell us. If he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. So, Noah, his sons, and their wives. So here we can see the timeline as to when the angels sinned. We know it was when. It must have been around the time of the flood. What happened around the time of the flood, which allowed angels to sin? Well, that's when angels and humans came together and made an offspring. That offspring was called the Nephilim, or Gigantes, or in English, it's called the giants. That is what 2 Peter is talking about. So in other words, the people that are following their own sensuality, because those were the verses ahead, they are connected to the angels and obviously the ideology that they were teaching human beings. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes, remember this, now we're seeing that it's connecting Sodom and Gomorrah. When was Sodom and Gomorrah? Later. So now we're seeing a lot of connections here with before and after the flood. If he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah by burning them to ashes and made them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. So in other words, Lot was living in a place that was completely ridiculous. And so he himself, he wasn't necessarily righteous by the law, but he was a nephew of Abraham. And of course, he was surrounded by a bunch of wicked people. So what do you kind of expect? You're kind of a product of your own environment. Lot meant well. For that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. Lot didn't like the place he was living. Remember, when the two angels came and they took Lot out of there, the men in the town wanted to rape the angels. In other words, they wanted to sleep with those men. The angels looked like men. If this is so, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and hold the unrighteous for punishment on the day of judgment. This is especially true of those who follow the corrupt desire of the flesh and despise authority. In other words, if you do what your emotions, what your flesh wants you to do, you will have the same fate as Sodom and Gomorrah. If you don't follow your spirit and you instead follow your flesh, Sodom and Gomorrah, you will have the same judgment as them. Also, those who despise authority. This one's really important because today I'm seeing in the churches of all places, they're despising authority. I'm seeing churches on the news where the pastors are defying laws that are being put by the state. The state says, because of the public health authority, you can't do XYZ. What are the churches doing? They're rebelling. That's despising authority. Where in the Bible does it say that you have to obey authority? Romans 13. These churches, these pastors, whether it's Winnipeg, whether it's Alberta, whether it's Ontario, you need to read Romans 13. God puts those authority in power. Same like we saw when we had bad kings or good kings in Israel. Regardless of the king or the politician, which would be the king of today, whether they are bad or good, you need to obey them. If you despise authority, again, this judgment is for you. So keep in mind, do not follow your emotions. Do not follow your flesh. Do not break the law. The law that the state puts in place, whether it's a good law or a bad law, until that law defies the 10 commandments, you keep it whether you like it or not. There is a connection between the false teachers and those who do not know Christ. So these churches, I challenge you, you do not know Christ because you are not keeping the law. Not the law of the 10 commandments we're talking at the moment. I mean, that's a whole separate conversation, but specifically, you are not keeping the laws of the state. Romans 13 says that God appoints the authorities. When you disrespect the authorities, when you break the laws of the authorities, it's God you're disrespecting. These are the ones that are perishing. If you're a lawbreaker, whether you break the law in regards to the 10 commandments or you break the law in regards to the law of the state, you are perishing. And the angels that sinned before the flood were the ones that taught this type of lawlessness. They taught, follow your heart. Follow your heart. You can't be wrong. Well, those angels are in hell right now. They're locked in chains. Deuteronomy 32, 31 to 32. Before I read this, let me give you some context. 32 of Deuteronomy is actually talking about what happened in Genesis 11. In Genesis 11, you had the building of the Tower of Babel. Once the people tried to challenge God, what was the outcome? All of the nations were then appointed to who? The sons of God. In the Greek Septuagint, if you read Deuteronomy 32, it'll tell you those are the angels. The angels were taking all of the people of the world, the Gentiles. The only people that were not taken by the sons of God were who? Israel. Jacob was the Lord's chosen lot. So God kept a people. After Babylon, God kept a people, but all the nations, they were taken by the sons of God. So now when we look at Deuteronomy 32, look what it says. For their rock is not like our rock. Who's their rock? Well, their rock would have to be some kind of a false god. Because, of course, the sons of God, they aren't Christ. They're angels. So we see their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies concede. But their vine is from that of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Didn't we find out that Christ is the vine and that's connected to Aaron's rod? So that means that there's a counterfeit vine. There's a counterfeit rock. Satan then is counterfeiting who? Christ. Their grapes are poisonous. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the venom of serpents, the deadly poison of cobras. So the people, for example, following Korah's rebellion, those who serve Baal or Bel, if you prefer, they're not following our rock. They rejected the chief cornerstone. The stone that the builders rejected was Christ. Have you heard of Shamash? Shamash is in the Bible. If you read about Lot's sons, remember Lot had sons. because his sons were the product of sleeping with his daughters. His daughters got him drunk. He slept with them, and he had two children. One was called Ben-Ami, which was the Ammonites, and then we had Moab, which later became the Moabites. Their god is Shamash. Shamash is a solar deity. Notice the images of Shamash, and we can see a winged sun. Look at this image. Here's Shamash. We can see a solar deity, a winged sun. Is this the false vine? Is this the vine of Sodom and Gomorrah? Is this the rock in Deuteronomy 32 that is not like our rock? Is this why Ezekiel said people will fall prey to sun worship? Oh, well, this is old news, right? People aren't worshiping this thing anymore. That's old news. The Gentiles, the nations of the world, they're not falling prey to this. Are you sure? Because on the left-hand side, this is the Washington Monument, put together by the founding fathers. It's inside of the big Egyptian obelisk. The obelisk that probably came from the city of On, as mentioned in the Greek Septuagint. The pillar city, the city of the sun. Heliopolis, the city of On, was the city of the sun. And this symbol sure looks like a lot like the symbol for Shamash. And if the Gentiles, the people in the other nations, if they aren't worshiping the sun, then why does the Bentley logo, Aston Martin logo, Harley Davidson logo, Austin Mini, Chrysler, which I think is actually Christ Slayer, and Southwest Airlines, and countless other logos, why are they all modeled after the Shamash? Are people worshiping the sun god still? Their vine is not like our vine. Their rock is not like our rock. It is a counterfeit. Satan is a counterfeit.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.